Hi, friends. Welcome to, I think this is our fifth odd week summer Sunday school class. We're doing a series on Do What You Have the Power to Do. These are 6 little stories of ordinary people who had interactions with Jesus, which provided teachable moments for him, and they give us food for thought. Today's lesson is a lesson in teamwork. Now, if I were to ask you which of the miracle stories, which of Jesus's miracles appear in all 4 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 testifiers, which ones would you say appear in all 4 Gospels? And the answer to that is that apart from the events of Holy Week, there's just one. There's only one miracle that occurs, not in 3 or 2 or 1, but in all 4. And that's a very well-known story, the story of the feeding of the 5,000, or the feeding of the multitudes. So that's the story that I want us to think about today. Some of you Bible scholars will know that there is a similar story called the feeding of the 4,000, and that one's told in Matthew and Mark. But the feeding of the 5,000 appears in all 4 Gospels, only this one story, and that might be something right there that commends it to us as of particular interest. So what I'm going to do is read it from the Gospel of John, and then we'll talk a little bit about how this compares and contrasts with the other tellings. So I'm going to read from John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14, and I'm reading from the New International Version. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he had already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go with so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Okay, that's the story. Each of the tellings of this famous story includes a few details that the others don't. And they appear, just for reference, in Matthew chapter 14, Mark chapter 6, and Luke chapter 9. How do the 4 accounts contrast? In other words, how do they differ? Well, Matthew tells us that Jesus had tried to go away to a quiet place after learning that John the Baptist had been killed by Herod, but crowds had followed him. Mark tells us that Jesus had invited the apostles to go with him so that they could get some rest, because they'd been so busy tending the crowds that they hadn't even had a chance to eat. Luke tells us that this story took place somewhere near the city of Bethsaida. John doesn't mention that town, but he mentions Philip and Andrew, who are both from Bethsaida. Now, in 3 of the accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's the disciples who approach Jesus after he's been teaching the whole day and healing the thousands of people who had followed him out into the countryside. In these 3 Gospels, the disciples ask Jesus to send the crowd away so that those people can find some food and maybe lodging in the villages nearby. The disciples point out it's late, and they're out in the middle of nowhere. And in all three of those Gospels, Jesus says almost the exact same thing in response to that question. You don't have to send them away. You give them something to eat. Now in John, this part's a little bit different. Here, Jesus initiates a discussion with two specific disciples, Philip and Andrew. He asks Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for them?" But John tells us Jesus already had a plan. Now, Philip's a practical man. He counts the cost. He's done the math, and he reports that 8 months' wages wouldn't be enough to feed this crowd. And now Andrew pipes up and points to a boy with 5 small loaves and 2 small fish, but he reckons that won't go very far. And then, in the other 3 Gospels, Jesus enlists the disciples in distributing the food. In John, he just has the disciples tell people to be seated. Just an aside for a minute about the matter of why are 4 Gospels not telling the story exactly the same way? Why are there some different details? Do you think that that discredits the Gospels as true testimony? Many people would say, no, if 4 different eyewitnesses or the traditions that came from 4 different witnesses told the same story, they would have different details. That's a sign that this thing really happened and people saw it with some differences of what they noted. At any rate, what strikes me the most about these 4 different tellings, including is the similarities in the 4, including a whole list of very specific numbers. Isn't this interesting? You can say it with me right here into your computer screen in the privacy of your home. How many people got fed? 5,000 men. Matthew adds, besides women and children. So possibly it was many more than 5,000 people. How many loaves were there? There were 5. How many fish were there? There were 2. How many baskets were left over? 12. Same. All the numbers are exactly the same in all 4 tellings. Okay. What's so important about this miracle story that this should be the only one that was told by the 4 different gospel writers, told 4 times with so many important details intact? I think maybe this story is so profound in the gospel because it teaches us that God gives us the hunger and God gives us the food. The way God feeds us may properly be considered miraculous, but it's the kind of miracle that requires teamwork, and human beings are on the team. So first, let's think for a minute about the hunger. Now, we can understand, hunger metaphorically here. We can understand bread metaphorically. All over the Gospels, Jesus talks about being the bread of life, his body being bread, man not living by bread alone. But I don't think we really need for this to be a metaphor in this story. This is actual, late in the day hunger of actual people, lots of them. All of them, in fact, are hungry, and that's right there in the heart of the story. Without this hunger, there's no story. Without this hunger, there's no miracle. Now, if you're lucky, maybe you've seen once or twice in your life a nest where the birds have just hatched, and the baby birds are there, and the parent birds are feeding them. Or maybe you've seen it on TV. If you've ever seen this sight in person or on film, what maybe struck you is that the main thing that you see in that nest of baby birds is mouths open. Baby birds are all mouth. And that is quite a job for those parent birds to keep those babies fed. And that used to be kind of how I pictured my life when I was a much younger mother than I am today. I'd be there in the kitchen chopping or mashing or putting something in a pot, and I would picture baby birds with their mouths open. And I would think, that's the job I have here. I've just got to keep this food coming. And I might think that there's something more important to be doing in life, or I might think there's even something more important to be doing for these children. But I haven't got time to do anything else because I just have to keep the food coming. I have to keep feeding them all the time, every day. And if you stop and think about it, this is a pretty intriguing part of the Creator's design plan. that everything, including us, has to eat. Pretty much every day is ideal. At least every day we'll be hungry. And not just every day, 3 times a day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, those are words in everybody's language. It has occurred to me that this is very inconvenient and maybe even inefficient. And there are diet plans that have tried to beat this rap, but they mostly don't work. What good comes of our being reminded every 8 hours or so of our waking life that we have to stop what we're doing and figure out how to get something to eat? Well, there's a rhythm to being a creature. And the Creator must have thought this was a good one. One advantage of it is that if you're the kind of person who says grace before every meal, at least you thank God 3 times a day. But where there's hunger, there has to be feeding. So let's think about that second, the feeding part. What does this famous story have to say about that? Now, the reason that I chose John's Gospel to talk about in particular is because it provides my favorite detail in this story, and that is the boy who has the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. In the other stories, someone has 5 loaves and 2 fish. In John's Gospel, he tells us it's a boy. And you've seen pictures of this fella offering his basket, I'm sure. And the next time you're wondering whether you have the power to do anything important about a big problem, an overwhelming problem, you might consider this kid. Picture him. Was this a small deed? It was, after all, only 5 small loaves, 2 small fish. But it was apparently 100% of what he had. Not only that, but this child had to relinquish, for the sake of the heedless and unprepared strangers in this crowd, what he, or maybe his mother, had so wisely thought to bring along. So I'm never willing to think of this boy's offering as something small. And it's not a bad prayer to ask for the grace to be willing to let all that you've prepared go for the sake of other people. So finally, let's think about the fact that in addition to this boy, the disciples of Jesus were on this team and on the job. They did notice that the people had to eat, which was nice of them, but their idea about how to feed them was mostly to send them away, to get rid of them. And maybe that would have worked. Go be responsible for yourself if you haven't prepared. But that's not how Jesus wanted to do it. What he did was deputize the disciples as organizers and distributors of the provisions. Have the people sit down. Mark and Luke tell us that Jesus further directed them to have the people sit down in groups of 50 or 100, and that there was enough room to do this, but maybe not with social distancing. And then, all the accounts agree, Jesus took the loaves and fishes and he gave thanks for them, and then he broke them and the disciples distributed them. Everyone, so the story goes, was satisfied. It doesn't tell us how many ounces of bread each person got. It doesn't tell us if everybody got the same amount. It tells us that what they got satisfied them. And then they picked up the leftover pieces. The story makes it clear that they only collected the leftover bread, not the fish. And how much was left? 12 baskets full. They all agree. I've seen debates. People want to dispute this. Well, how big was the basket? These baskets, were they little baskets? Were they big baskets? Different words can apply to different size baskets. That's not the point. The point is that there was enough to satisfy everyone, provided by Providence, the great provider. It satisfied everybody with more to spare, with enough to remind us of the 12 tribes of Israel, or the 12 disciples. The word of the hour was enough. The hunger that's at the core of our life as children of God is satisfied with bread to spare. Who feeds these people, these lost lambs, these unprepared seekers? Who feeds us? Well, you might want to speculate that Jesus didn't really need this well-prepared boy with the willing spirit in order to perform his miracle. You may want to say that if the disciples hadn't been there, somebody else could have organized the distribution. That if Jesus hadn't inspired these humble people to do what they at first didn't realize they had the power to do, then he would have found someone else. Well, if you want to say that, you'll have to write your own gospel story. Because in this one, told 4 times, 4 ways, and pointing to one truth, it took a team to feed these people. Christ's heart, their hands, and that's the story. So food for thought, and we'll see you next time.